To say that I was not really hoping for much from Iuno's story would honestly be a bit of a damning but accurate assessment of my expectations. After experiencing Augusta's story, which was pretty good but not really mind-blowing for me, I didn't really think that Iuno's story could be anything spectacular, so I kind of didn't really pay it much heed. The drip marketing for Iuno honestly did not get me that excited either, so besides some cursory note-taking I did for her before the patch hit, I wasn't thinking of too much, to be honest. However, to say that the story, when it did come out, was above my expectations is a massive understatement. While it was really more of a character quest than a main story quest in my opinion, it still was very well paced, the story very well told, and the cinematics, as always, were just fucking spectacular. However, I think you all know that, because you can really just experience that yourself. What really kind of shook me, personally, a little bit of course, is probably also the same reason you're watching this video. The symbolism and references to culture and literature especially that showed up within the story. While I think that it admittedly wasn't as advanced or complicated in the way that previous resonators such as Phrolova, Brand, or Chacona were in terms of the symbolism, I felt that a lot of the references within Iuno's story, on the contrary, was rather beautiful in the way that they kind of mesh with the storytelling. So, anyway, I don't really want to leave you guys all hanging because there is a lot to go through today. So, without further ado, make sure you know that there will be spoilers past this point if you have not played the story yet. On next page, there will be a glossary, and with that, let us begin.
Salve amica mea nox, ut loquite cum mea vox.
One of the very first aspects of symbolism I thought of for Iuno is how she may relate to priestesses and oracles, being that she is the head divinator or priestess within the Tetragon Temple in-game. And the primary thought I had, even before she was released, was how she was really just related to the priestesses at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, who were seen as the most prestigious oracles within the Greek and Roman world until basically Christianity really began to take over the Roman Empire. Delphi, in ancient Greek times, was seen as basically the center of the world, so it was not surprising that generals, emperors, and kings would come from all over the classical world in order to get advice and predictions of the future from the Delphic oracle. The fact that you learn in Iuno's story as well that her mother's name is Sibylla, which refers to the word for a Greek prophetess, being a Sibyl, and is often used to describe the ones at Delphi, really kind of lent a lot of credence to the reference when I actually started playing the story. So, the head of the priestesses in the temple of Delphi, of course, not the Tetragon Temple yet, was a figure called the Pythia, otherwise known as the head priestess, or the singular Oracle of Delphi. Wearing a laurel wreath that was thought to house the god of Apollo itself, it's quite obvious that Iuno's role and visuals draw a lot of design language from the Delphic Pythia, with both being the head priestesses of temples designed to basically provide prophecies and advice for rulers and generals. We've actually already gone through one of these in Augusta's video, where we said that one of the Tetragon Temple's prophecies is actually a mirror to the prophecy given to King Leonidas by the Delphic Oracle, so the reference to the Temple of Apollo at Delphi is already quite firmly there. However, the similarities between the two aren't just that. Historically, one of the most unique features of the Delphic Oracle was actually how they told their prophecies. Even though the historical references to this are quite scarce, the sources that we do have all seem to agree that the Pythia told her prophecies when she was under a sort of catatonic frenzied state after having effectively gotten high off sniffing vapors that had, in most versions, emerged from the ground. This is a rather rudimentary way of describing how they tell prophecies, so I do apologize to any Greek person I managed to offend just now, but the reason why I said this at all is because all of the priestesses at the Tetragon Temple in-game draws immense parallels to how the Delphic oracles most likely operated historically. When you enter the Tetragon Temple for the first time in Augusta's story, you can see the way they tell prophecies is through the smelling of a special metal powder, which puts them in an unresponsive, prophetic kind of state that allows them to provide vague words of insight, such as when Rover is given a prophecy by Grandmother Lilibet. As far as I know, there aren't really any other kind of Greek or Roman priestesses that told prophecies in a specific way. And it was a really unique way, which is why the Delphic Pythia was so famous for doing it. So it's rather clear to me that Kuro took a lot of inspiration from the Temple of Delphi when it came to designing both Iuno's character, story, and the Tetragon Temple itself. But if you still aren't sold on this connection, I still do have one thing to compare, which is the actual structure of the Tetragon Temple itself. If you look at the temple in-game, then look at the real Delphic temple, I'm sure you can see that there is a lot of parallel design language between the two. Even though it is true that a lot of classical temples had the same structure, most Roman temples were located in cities, rather than being freestanding in the countryside with numerous structures around it, like the Greek ones. And even when you compare both the outline of the Temple of Delphi with the Tetragon Temple, there is a substantial overlap between the two that I don't really think is a coincidence if you put them side by side. All in all, it honestly doesn't surprise me that Kuro chose to base Iuno and the Temple Priestess's concept in Septimont on the Delphic Temple of Apollo, because, as we've already gone through before, they were basically the most prestigious important oracles and prophets for basically all of classical history. With that general concept overview out of the way, we can essentially now start looking at some of the concepts more specific to Iuno's story. One of the topics I talked about within my Augusta video is a sort of comparison of the beliefs of Septimont being related to classical paganism, while the religion of Leviathan is a twisted perversion, a sort of inversion of Christianity. Within it, we talked about how Leviathan's religion, as a sort of dark tide that would sink Septimont into a false paradise, sort of mirrors the effect of Christianity and the collapse of the Western Empire. In this comparison, we actually see a very interesting parallel between this trend that we already talked about and the Delphic oracles we just talked about in the previous section, with what was the last recorded prophecy in history given by the Delphic oracle before the Temple of Apollo itself basically vanishes from history with the rise of Christianity. Go tell the king. Apollo's ornate temple has fallen to the ground. Phoebos has his hut no more, nor his prophetic laurel, nor his murmuring spring. His eloquent waters now make no sound. This prophecy, given to Emperor Julian the Apostate in 362 AD, laments the decline in pagan belief as Christianity basically overtakes the Roman Empire. And this relates really heavily with the story of 2.6, as Iuno, even in Augusta's story, tells us of a sort of prophetic vision of the fall of Septimont, which we discussed previously could be related to the fall of the Western Roman Empire to be overtaken by a new faith. Within the Delphic prophecy, Apollo, the god of the sun, has effectively fallen, and the prophetic laurel, which represents the Pythia and Iuno in extension, has fallen to the dark tide. One of the most striking parallels I found in the Delphic prophecy is actually an activity you can do on the Sangui Plateau map, where you look through the visions that Grandmother Lilibet gives to the player. Within this, you have to interact with a spring, which then dries up after Lilibet's vision disappears, which is the same as the murmuring spring within the prophecy. Specifically, this is a reference to the holy Castalian spring in Delphi, which was where Apollo was supposedly, in Greek mythology, killed the Python and later established his own temple. This may be a bit of a stretch, but I think that Python is an analogue of Leviathan, and the drying up to the spring in the real Delphic prophecy is essentially a one-for-one for Iuno's prophecy of the fall of Septimont, where Leviathan is prophesied to sink the land with the dark tide, drowning out the clear spring of the sun. During Iuno's story, we gain further reference to this spring, where we learn that Iuno and the version of the world we need to fix died 3 years ago in the spring basin where the dark tide stemmed from in the first place. This is the most obvious reference, in my opinion, to the Castalian spring and the Pythia's final prophecy, if any. Just like how the real Delphic oracle gave her final despairing prophecy as her world came to ruin, Iuno laments the prophecy of Septimont's fall in the very spring basin she was meant to die in. Just as Apollo's murmuring spring speaks no more, Kuro, I think quite intentionally, chose to make the entire route of Septimont's dark tide, and with it, the false sovereign and his paradise being a twisted mockery of Christianity, come to drown Septimont from the source of the Delphic spring, which, as we said before, was considered the center of the world in Greek times. As Leviathan's paradise rises, the prophetic spring will dry to nothing.
I am Iuno, the most gifted priestess Septimont has seen in generations. Besides, the sacred flames already showed me my end. In the warmth of spring, surrounded by white flowers, with gentle eyes watching over me. Nightingales sing in their familiar tune.
As you may be able to guess, if you've been wondering where my usual analysis of resonator names has gone, Iuno's name in itself is not without meaning or intention. Iuno is a Latin play on the name of one of its most important figures, being Juno, or Iuno, related to the Greek Hera, but also being slightly different at the same time. Iuno was a sort of queen goddess of the Roman pantheon, and was even one of the 3 goddesses or gods enshrined on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. If that name sounds familiar, that's because the area of the capital city of Septimont is literally called the Capitoline Hill, named after its real-life counterpart. It really could not be more obvious. So, as a sort of mother figure of Rome, Iuno makes prophecies for Septimont's auguries that influence the course of Augustus' actions and that of the state. If you've studied or even know of Iuno or the Greek Hera, one thing you might realize is that Iuno's personality, the one we have in game, is actually kind of based on the goddess that she is named after. It sounds kind of wrong to call Hera a jealous tsundere, but she kind of is, so we'll stick with that. Beside that, Iuno, as a sort of mother goddess of Rome, functioned not only as a sort of counsellor, but also as a bastion of stability of the Roman state itself, which makes a lot of sense if you consider the immense sacrifices that Iuno herself makes in order to secure the future of Septimont. If you look at stories of Juno in Roman culture, of which the one I read for researching this video being Virgil's Aeneid, Iuno's figure as a goddess is essentially as a sort of manifestation of the stability or protection of the state, which Iuno herself in-game matches very well. In averting the crisis of the prophecy of Septimont, she will pay any price to secure its future, even if it costs her her life. One of the more obvious dualities that was clear even before the release of Iuno's story is how she and Augusta compare to the classical figures of Artemis and Apollo, which is all throughout her story. Being born as twins in Greek mythology, both of them are symbolic of the moon and sun respectively, which is something that is reflected in the design of Augusta and Iuno themselves. When we even look at the Delphic oracles, for example, their temple was a temple of Apollo, which basically means that they were priestesses of Apollo, in the same way that Iuno is effectively Augusta's state priestess. Besides just being related to the moon, the imagery of Artemis is all over Iuno's design and story. The constant references to archery relate to the idea that Artemis is also the goddess of the hunt, and is commonly depicted with the bow and the stag, which relates to the idea that Artemis is symbolic of many things. Of the moon, of maidens, of hunting, of archery, and the wilderness, of which Iuno essentially is fully related to her in her design. In fact, when we consider Artemis in more of modern times, we connect her as a goddess to the concept of the moon bow, or the younger stage of the lunar cycle, which is why so many depictions of both Artemis and Iuno utilize the theme of archery and the moon together. We're going to talk about this in much more detail in the next chapter, because there's actually something else we need to talk about before we discuss how the three Roman and Greek goddesses relate to the triple lunar cycle, so I'm going to need to hold off on further talking about the moon bow for just a second.
The flames of fate lit long ago. A priestess born in a lunar eclipse sees what others never will. To anchor the future of Septimont. From that moment on, the life of Iuno was thus ordained.
As you may be able to tell from the previous sections we've gone through on Iuno symbolism, one thing that's pretty clear is that she isn't solely based on one goddess or figure, rather being an amalgamation of multiple classical inspirations. Specifically speaking, after looking at all the drip marketing, and now having actually played through Iuno's story, one of the most important symbols that keeps showing up is the lunar cycle of the crescent and full moons that shows up everywhere in her design and story. Specifically, one particular symbol that I saw quite often and found interesting is the image of the full moon being flanked on each side by the young and the waning crescent moon, which instantly kicked my brain into gear, because this image is actually symbolic of a rather famous classical reference of the three triple goddesses of classical times: Artemis, which represents the maiden and the younger stage of the moon; Selene, the Roman moon goddess, that represents the lady and the full moon; and finally Hecate, that represents the crone, or old woman, and the waning crescent moon. If you pay attention in her story and within her design, these details in different stages of the moon are actually all over the place. For example, Iuno's story is heavily based on discussing determinism and prophecies, which I think doesn't just relate to the prophecies of the Tetragon Temple, but also Hecate's prophecies all the way back in the 2.0 Hecate boss fight. It spoils a lot about Renasita's chapter 2. Besides Hecate being the waning moon of the triple lunar goddesses, every time a symbol of the moon shows up during a time that Iuno tells a prophecy of Septimon's doom, or is trapped in a purgatory between life and death and chaos, the moon icons are either blighted by the dark tide, or in the shape of Hecate's waning moon. Hecate is even symbolized as a goddess of the Underworld and Crossroads, both of which are significantly referenced to within the story. On the other hand, Iuno herself with her bow in scenes where she was breaking out of the dark tide with her moon bow is nearly always in the shape of Artemis's rising moon, which symbolizes ferociousness as not only the youthful goddess of the moon, but also that of hunting and archery. In relation to triple lunar goddesses, Artemis essentially embodies free-spiritedness and rebellion as a young stage of the moon, but we already talked about this in a previous section, so I won't dwell on it too much. This leads us to the final goddess, being Selene, the Roman moon goddess that embodies the completeness of the moon. As you can probably guess, within Iuno's story and trailer, the image of Selene's phase of the moon only shows up when the world is in its correct and good order, such as at the end of Iuno's story through Chaos, when she finally grasps the Lunarum bow to use to fight the Dark Tide. The whole concept of anchoring, which is essential to bringing Iuno's spectre back to the real world, is actually even a reference to how Selene as a goddess anchors the moon to Earth through tides and gravity. By representing completeness, she essentially functions as a symbol at the end of the story, when the anchoring is finally complete, and Iuno's spirit is whole again. One very interesting thing that you may have picked up on is that Hecate, being one of the 3 goddesses of the lunar cycle, would place Phrolova in relation to Iuno, considering that Hecate is her echo of choice. Besides this, however, there are actually a glaring number of similarities between them both that I really think it warrants an entire section to talk about. For example, for one, the Hecate reference I've already explained, but also, both their stories essentially discuss prophecies and fate, with both their narratives being about determinism and basically rewriting what has been decided. Phrolova's references to Macbeth, which you can watch my video on if you want to learn about it, is actually very striking, because Macbeth as a play is all about determinism and fulfilling a terrible prophecy, much like in Iuno's story. Within both stories as well, the characters are stuck in a sort of limbo, a sort of purgatory. Phrolova within a gap between life and death of her choosing, and Iuno in a rendition of the Greek underworld, which is also a sort of middle ground after one has physically died, but before one can spiritually pass on to death. It's very fascinating. However, what I think really seals the deal of the connection between these two characters is actually a short scene after story, where you go to Asphodel Barrens to watch the moon with Iuno. In that sort of cutscene, Iuno says a very striking line. "There's more than one moon here. There's one above and one in the water. Tell me, which do you think is harder to reach?" When I first saw this line, I got a massive lightbulb moment, because this was obviously a reference to one of Phrolova's post-story scenes as well, where you go into the Lost Beyond to try and scoop a violin out of the water. Within it, you basically try to scoop up a reflection of the moon out of the pond 3 times and fail, which represents how such a thing is effectively impossible. Just like how Phrolova's quest, and going back to the days that she yearned for playing violin for a village, scooping a reflection of the moon out of the water is a similarly impossible act. Now, when you compare this to what Iuno says in her quest, the correlation becomes glaringly obvious. Iuno's quest has been all about rewriting predestined fate and essentially conquering the seemingly impossible. So this idea of attaining the moon itself in her story, of even shooting it out of the sky to escape chaos, symbolizes making the impossible possible. That's why when she talks about the reflection of the moon in the water in Asphodel Barrens, she acknowledges that it is hard, but not that it is impossible. Just like how she and Rover went to twist fate itself to escape chaos, Iuno's capturing of both the moon and its waterborne reflection represents how she would do what was thought to be impossible.
Wait, Augusta! I've been thinking. Our final fate might already be written, but how we walk that path is up to us. We as humans are meant to carve our own way forward. If we can't rewrite fate, then we chase it, outpace it. Then when we catch up, we'll smack it right in the face. Don't forget what you once said. A ruler assumes their place by accomplishing the impossible for their subjects.
So being that most of Iuno's quest takes place within the environment known as the Chaos, it's probably inevitable that I would talk about what it is inspired by. Once you experience the scenery of the realm within chaos with its broken, dark environments, it becomes very clear that it is based on the Greek underworld, with its flowing rivers and it being a state between life and death, where one's spirit resides before being accepted as truly dead. The whole place, surrounded by darkness and filled with flowing, murky rivers, and inhabited by ghosts and shades, is iconic of the underworld of Hades. However, within the chaos, there are some rare moments of light and brilliance, in the form of the lunarum bows that scatter your journey through chaos, and even finally at the end, where the grand tree bathed in white marks your final destination. This, at least according to my theory, is a reference to white poplar trees which were said to line the rivers and paths of the Greek underworld. For example, the tree was said to line the banks of the river Acheron, where souls would enter to meet Hades. This brilliant white tree was originally a nymph called Leuce, who Hades abducted to live with him in the underworld after he fell in love with her. As such, Leuce, as a sort of fairy and a sort of surface dweller that was living in the underworld, she became the only source of light and life within an otherwise very dark place, a role that she took on even after she died and transformed into white poplar trees that dot the land of death. Because of this, Leuce and the tree that she eventually became represents a sort of hope in the midst of death, and also regeneration and the conquering of death itself. This is actually because the white poplar tree is intensely tied to Heracles, who crowned himself with a leaf from the tree once he returned from conquering the trial in the Greek underworld, subsequently making it a sort of holy tree in Greek culture. This is why, in the scene where Rover grows the final and biggest lunarum bow and starts hacking at it to make Iuno's bow, a very distinct scene of one of the tree's leaves falling plays as the scene cuts to Iuno, with them basically reclaiming the leaf on the other side. This scene is a reference to Heracles' trial in conquering death, and it's pretty significant that the lunarum bow's leaf, which is very likely to be based on the leaf of the white poplar, shows up as Iuno goes through a final climactic battle against chaos.
No. Even if the end is here, unavoidable, I still have the right to refuse. The lunarum bow has grown strong. Just bring me back to your gravity.
One of the important things I actually failed to mention in the Augusta video is the classical concept of the Katabasis, which is essentially a journey through the underworld, where a character usually manages to enter and then escape it, basically visiting the underworld as a living person and also managing to leave as such. Within Greek culture, a person is only able to do this once in their lives, before basically being barred from going to the underworld a second time until they actually die. A lot of famous heroes within classical stories take this plunge, such as Homer's Odysseus, Heracles in his trials, and even Aeneas in Virgil's Aeneid, going on a sort of trial to define themselves as a hero by conquering death itself. If you look at the scene where Augusta is swallowed by the dark tide and faces a version of the Greek underworld, crossing its damn rivers to eventually find herself and break free from the doom and death, it's very obviously essentially a hero's Katabasis. However, not every Katabasis ends in a happy ending. The rather well-known Katabasis I haven't talked about is actually essentially the framework of Iuno's entire story and the journey through chaos itself, being the infamous story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Within Greek legend, Orpheus was a musician blessed by Apollo himself, being gifted a lyre that let him play music, and that could enchant even monsters and gods. He eventually fell in love with a beautiful woman called Eurydice, but their marriage was not to last for long, as eventually Eurydice was bitten by a snake and died. Being consumed by grief, Orpheus played a melody that was so powerful that even the god of the underworld, Hades, was moved. Because of this, Hades allowed Orpheus to undergo Katabasis, where he entered the underworld and met Hades himself. Hades liked his music so much that he gave Orpheus a proposition, that Orpheus would be able to bring Eurydice back from the underworld to the world of the living, something that he had never allowed before, under only two conditions. The first was that the shade or spirit of Eurydice would always have to walk behind him while he guided her out of the underworld, and the second was that he could not look back to see his wife the entire journey until the light of the surface made her human again. Otherwise, Eurydice would be banished to stay in the underworld forever. Orpheus accepted these conditions and began to lead the spirit of his wife, clutching her hand, out of the land of the dead, but lost faith right before the exit as he suspected that Hades had tricked him. He turned around to find that the shade of his wife had indeed been there the whole time, but having broken the second condition, the spirit of his wife disappeared, and he wailed in grief, as she was doomed to the underworld forever. While Iuno's story is not a flat one-for-one of the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice, there are so many parallels that it is basically provable beyond reasonable doubt that this is the inspiration for Iuno's quest. Rover essentially undergoes a Katabasis into chaos to save the forgotten and effectively dead Iuno from the clutches of chaos, which we already previously discussed is a mirror to the Greek underworld. Once they enter, they find a spectre or a shade of Iuno rather than an actual person, which mirrors the state that Eurydice was in when Orpheus had to guide her, effectively spectral, like a ghost halfway between life and death. The whole hand-holding mechanic in the quest, beyond just being romantic, is obviously also symbolic of the trek Orpheus has to make with the spirit of Eurydice out of the underworld, holding onto her hand and walking in front of her the whole way, just like in Greek legend. At least to me, as soon as I saw that, it just seems so obvious of a reference. The only point where Iuno's story differs from that of Orpheus and Eurydice supposedly is the ending, since we actually do save Iuno at the end of the story, and that seems to feel like it doesn't match until you realize that, firstly, Iuno is actually swallowed by chaos near the end of the story, asking you instead to meet her at the end, which is basically the same as Orpheus leaving the underworld empty-handed. And also secondly, Iuno's story is all about going against fate, about rewriting bad endings. In this rendition of the story, even though Rover walks out of chaos alone, Iuno meets him at the end of the journey as promised, making the impossible possible. Even if fate has willed Orpheus to fail, Eurydice will shatter the moon itself to escape the clutches of the underworld. As a final small point, I think it would be appropriate to talk about where I think the whole concept of forgetting, or the erasure of existence, comes from in terms of classical culture and symbolism. While a lot of people will just joke that Iuno got remmed or re-zeroed at the end of Augusta's story, there is actually a real-life reference where the wiping of memory comes from. Well, there's actually two references. The first is one that I actually talked about in my Phrolova video already, being the river Leuce of the Greek underworld. A soul who drinks from this river essentially loses all of their memories and is ready to be reborn, hence the memory erasing component of the chaos in Iuno's story. However, being that Iuno voluntarily gave up her memories, there is something which I think is a bit more relevant here, the Roman concept of the Damnatio Memoriae. The Damnatio Memoriae was essentially a specific Senate decree within Roman history, where the memory and physical clues of a person's existence were legally erased. Usually reserved for terrible people, such as traitors or awful emperors after they had passed, the practices of Damnatio Memoriae included not only scrubbing people off record books, like how we would censor modern photographs, but also taking down and the defacing of statues and any other physical evidence of a person's existence, such as coins, for example. The very beginning of the story, when you are trying to hunt for Iuno, is a reference to all of this essentially, that all the physical evidence of her existence is gone from the Tetragon Temple, from everywhere except the moon bracelet that Rover holds. And that falls into the other interesting thing about the Roman practice of Damnatio Memoriae, which is that it didn't actually really work. Besides just the fact that physical obliteration of the entirety of a person's existence is really difficult to begin with, hence the fact that Iuno's presence was still evidenced by the single Tetragon Temple record and Rover's moon bracelet, the main reason that Damnatio Memoriae was always kind of half-baked in Roman history is that you couldn't really fully erase the concept of someone's existence from people's memory, because people would still remember, right? That's why so many of the figures that are in Roman history that underwent Damnatio Memoriae, such as Nero and Commodus, haven't really just failed to be erased, but are actually really infamous instead. And I think that is something that is really important to discuss within Iuno's story, because as Eurydice says close to the beginning, existence is anchored in connection, feelings, and memory. They are its very manifestation. And when you think about that in relation to Iuno, I think it's actually very fitting. Even if Iuno is completely erased from existence, the only valid proof that she is real is Rover's memory and connection to her, because that's what, in the end, will last from someone's existence. It isn't statues or even written records that will eventually fade to dust, but the fact that people actually remember you. Eurydice's hypothetical of a person that could be manifested through memory and anchoring is not only a dark foreshadowing for what may happen in the future, but also related to essentially what we do to bring Iuno to a sort of existence. By recovering her memories one by one, we reverse the Damnatio Memoriae that has been inflicted upon her by chaos, making her whole once again. As always, I would like to extend my thanks if you've managed to reach all the way to the end of the video. To be honest, I wasn't expecting so much from Iuno's story, so to say that I was surprised would be a massive understatement, really. I am quite looking forward to what we have in store for 2.7, as we're going to be getting Galbrina and Shogun, with both of which I already have some thoughts on in regards to symbolism and references. So as always, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I wish you a good day. Until next time.
Juno, one last question. For someone without an unwritten fate, is it true they can never break free, no matter how hard they struggle?
I don't know.
That's all right. Let's go, Rover.
Wait, Augusta! I've been thinking. Our final fate might already be written, but how we walk that path is up to us. We as humans are meant to carve our own way forward. If we can't rewrite fate, then we chase it, outpace it. Then when we catch up, we'll smack it right in the face. Don't forget what you once said. A ruler assumes their place by accomplishing the impossible for their subjects.
Fate led you here, priestess, and now you dare to defy it.
No. I was never following anything. Every step was my own chooses to shine on the darkness ahead. Then it's up to me to draw fate's bow and release it where I choose. The flames of fate lit long ago. The gifted priestess would anchor the future of Septimund. From that moment on, my destiny was always mine to define.